welcome to the Security in Context podcast. My name is Claire O'Brien. In this episode, we give you an interview conducted by a member of the Security in Context team, Firat Demir, who is a professor of economics at the University of Oklahoma. His guests are Ahmad Mohammadpour and Kamal Soleimani.
My name is Firat Demir from the Center for Peace and Development and the Department of Economics at the University of Oklahoma. Today I am happy to be talking with two distinguished guests, Ahmad Mohammadpour and Kamal Soleimani. Ahmad is a Kurdish sociologist and anthropologist. He received his PhD in sociology from Shiraz University in Iran, and he is also a PhD candidate in anthropology at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, where he is currently teaching courses on Kurdistan and nationalism and ethno-religious conflicts in the contemporary Middle East. Dr. Mohammadpour has taught at various universities in the US, Iran, and Iraq, and his most recent work focuses on the persistence of Aryanist discourse and the ways in which it has sustained an ethno-linguistic and racialized hierarchy and produced a core periphery divide in Iran. Kamal Soleimani specializes in Islamic and Middle Eastern history and politics and is a professor at Colmex in Mexico City. Dr. Soleimani received his PhD in Islamic and Middle Eastern history from Columbia University and has taught in various Mexican, Turkish, and American universities. He is the author of a long list of scholarly articles appeared in major academic journals. In his book, Islam and Competing Nationalisms in the Middle East, which came out from Palgrave in 2016, he questions the foundational epistemologies of the nation-state by focusing on the pivotal and intimate role that Islam played in the nation-state's emergence. He shows how the entanglements and reciprocities of nationalism and religious thought played out in the modern history of the Middle East. So, dear Ahmed and Kamal, welcome, first of all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And academic scholarship on Kurds and Kurdistan are very limited, as you both know very well. And I, for one, really appreciate your work on exploring these intersections of nation building and ethno-religious nationalism in the Middle East, particularly in Kurdistan. And a few questions to see how this works out. In many of your works, and especially in your recent articles that you penned together, you refer to the Kurdish other. Can you explain what you mean by it, and what role does it play in legitimizing the denial, assimilation, and oppression of Kurds in Iran and also in other parts of Kurdistan?
Well, as you know, it's a big question. Well, the term othering, as you know, it's a post-colonial theoretical concept that basically refer to a sort of reductive action of labeling and defining a culture as a subaltern native or as an inferior community. So the othering or otherizing is a colonial dynamic, and we felt that because we look at the Kurdistan from the post-colonial perspective, and we believe that the Kurdistan is an international colony, and based on that framework, we came to conclusion that what is going on in Kurdistan right now, specifically with the Eastern Kurds, because we are working on the Eastern Kurds, as you know, is we can't pretend that we cover all parts of Kurdistan. Basically, by otherizing or by othering, we mean a sort of let's say intellectual, political, economic, and cultural discourse that defines and labels Kurdish culture and community as some sort of inferior to the dominant ethnic group. Well, if you want me to talk about it, we have a lot to discuss here, but very briefly, the othering or the othering of Kurds came to being with the establishment of the modern state. I know that it is a big question, and it needs a big answer, but very briefly, with the establishment of the modern nation state in Iran, basically in 1925, all non-Persian, because as you may know, the Iranian modern state was built on the idea of the homogeneity and uniformity of the nation. And this nation was supposed to be based on the Persian language and And at that time, there was no element of, at least the element of Shiism was not highlighted at that time. But basically, the Persian became the premise on which to build the national identity. And it's from that time that all non-Persian languages, and then after that, during Islamic Republic, the non-Shia communities, they became sort of, let's say, anomaly, abnormal identities, those who were not capable of the basically carrying any seeds of civilization and development. So Kurdistan and Kurds was one of those others of the Iranian national identity from the very beginning, when the Iranian nation state basically was established based on the idea of one culture, one language, one state, one nation. And the question was that, so whose nation, whose definition of nation, whose definition of language? Well, of course, the Persian ethnic group at that time, they became the founder of or basically they credited themselves as a founder of the Iranian identity, as a founder and holder of the Iranian national identity. Any identity, any group, any community that didn't fit these sort of criteria, well, they became and they were treated as other, including Kurds, Arabs, Baluch, and all of those non-Shia and non-Persian communities. So I don't know if I answered your question, but let's go ahead. But this is a very brief history of why we call Kurds as the other, or as you said, the ethnic other.
Okay. And in one of your articles, you also asked the question of can non-Persians speak? And I think it's a great way of putting it. And as you know, this othering and also treatment of Kurdish language as a dialect of Persian that you explain has been common throughout Kurdistan. For example, in Turkey, Kurdish language was illegal till 1991, and it's still common to refer to Kurdish as a dialect of Turkish in that case. So can they speak? Can non-Persians, in this case, can Kurds speak?
So it's exactly the case that just as Ahmad talked about, the fact that when we talk about the nation, as Judith Butler and Spivak have a book called Who Sings the Nation State? And here we, in a sense, what we say is who expresses the nation state. The reality is that all these nations or the states or the nation state that dominating the Kurds or Kurds are considered part of their population, they have their own definition of the nation, which they are extremely exclusive. And the base premise and philosophy is to homogenize the entire population. So, which then, in a kind of more sophisticated policy of homogenization and assimilation in places like Iran, and it made the Kurdish question extremely complex, because as if they are tolerated the way it appears from the outside, or many people do not know even there are Kurds in for example, in a place like Iran. It's because the Kurds can be tolerated to a degree that are potential Persians. So they are in this process of becoming. And that's why the otherness of the Kurds is, from the beginning of the idea of nation state, has been there. Kurds are a population that have to be dealt with, either by force, either by acculturation, or using various institutions, including the army, to turn these people into real Iranians. And there are various documents, and you have a similar process in Turkey, but in Turkey, so in both Turkey and Iran, while there is denial, and at the same time there is a systemic work to turn these Kurds into either Turks or Persians. So then this is, as Ahmed talked about it, you have this, after this, you have this civilizational discourse. The very emphasis on and stresses on Kurdishness itself becomes a civilizational issue. The persistence and the resistance in these areas where you have in Kurdistan becomes the issue of civilization. So there is a talk about the remnant of the persistence of the old order that resists the civilization, resists the law and order, and that's why at the end, ultimately, it's the army that has to deal with it. So, since the ones who define the nation are not the Kurds or not others, either in not just the Kurds, but non-Persians, in reality, the talking so when we ask that can non-Persians talk or speak, it's a reference to this very idea that the Kurds cannot determine their identity or express their identity. They would be defined by the colonial other. That's why, as Ahmed mentioned, and this term was coined by Ismail Beshkti in 1960s, late 1960s, not only Kurdistan is an international colony, it's at the same time an internal colony in each of these countries, because as a group, you have a collective of people, a nation or an ethnic group that are not homogenized, and at the same time, no status, they have no status at all. Their language, their history, their culture, everything has to be defined by the state. And as you were talking about, that they say, for instance, Kurdish, a dialect of Turkish, or Kurdish is a dialect of Persian, or in Iran they say is an Iranian language, which Iranian, again, it goes back to the idea who can speak. Iranians is actually always Iranianness equated with the Persianness, because the central components of the Iranianness are Persian language, Persian ethnicity, Persian history. So this is how the idea of Kurds or non-Persians can non-Persians speak, becomes the very reality of these, or expresses embodies this very intercolonial relationship between the periphery, which here we talk about the Kurds, and the central Persian.
Thank you. Perhaps we can dig into two issues that you already highlighted. One is the religious discourse and what you call the marriage of religious discourse with that of nationalism. And the second one is the political regime. And you are talking about Iran, Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. This has been both within each country and also across countries have had many different political regimes, right? I look at Iran, you discuss about the situation of Kurds before the Islamic Revolution and after the Islamic Revolution. And Turkey and Iraq and Syria also have had similar transitions and different political regimes at different points in time after the nation states were created. But why don't we first look at the religious issue? Like, what do you mean by the marriage of the religious discourse with nationalism in Iran in their approach to Kurdistan, including encouraging conversion of Sunni Kurds to Shiism, but also in the wider context?
So then let me talk about the religious aspect. I leave the other aspects for Ahmad. Briefly, the way I see the marriage or the fusion between religion and nationalism, the way I see modern religion and modern Islam, to be more precise, is a product of post-colonial product. In its entirety, modern Islam is a reaction to colonialism. And in this reaction, Islam has come to see itself, if we could, because referring to Islam as a proper name has become, actually, again, itself is a post-colonial thing. And before late 19th century, this reference to Islam as Islam among the Muslims was not very common. You cannot find 5 title books with the title of Islam before that. So this itself, seeing itself from the perspective or from behind the lenses of the other, it's exactly what explains modern Islam, which is essentially political and extremely ideological. And it has emerged mostly or shaped or formed in a way that in every aspect of it, as a religion in itself, always defined itself in relation to the other. And mostly this other is the Western, so it's the West. This aspect of Islam has made it extremely political power oriented as a religion, and has turned it mostly into a political ideology that modern Islam is essentially concerned with the political power and the state power. So and this characteristic of Islam made it extremely so it helped, it has become a ground. These aspect of Islam has become a ground for reinterpreting Islam among Muslims, reinterpreting Islam in relation to the state power. That's why what we see in the around the world, these what they call it political Islam, modern Islam, or fundamentalism, they all share certain characteristics. And it's interesting. Actually, for many people, this sounds like something unexpected, but they share many characteristics with Kemalism, the way they see state essential to the Islamic thought. So, and then because of this aspect, that this centrality of the idea of the state in thinking about Islam, Islam becomes, as I said, very much concerned with the state power. And the way, because the modern state is essentially is a nation state, the relationship between modern Islamic thought and the state power becomes extremely complex and very much affected by the very thinking about the nation state. And no, despite my long work on modern Islamic thought, there is no alternative to the nation state. And every single group that talks about an Islamic state, essentially they are talking about nation state or a more conservative modern nation state. In terms of the framework, in terms of thinking about state, the state power, it's there is no essential difference between the way the Islamists imagine the state or other forms of, or secular nationalists imagine the state. So I stop here.
No, thank you. So would it be correct then to use the same framework to explain why or how different, completely fundamental different political regimes, at least from outside, could produce similar attitudes and reactions and treatments towards Kurds and other minorities, be that ethnic minorities or religious minorities, that may change from one country to the next? The effect of the nation state, perhaps what you may call the original sin of nation state, producing very similar reactions and attitudes towards others, including Kurds, which as you know, is still the biggest minority group in the region. The religious minorities could at one point deal with their own way, and they don't see perhaps as a big threat to them anymore. But Kurds remain as the biggest, perhaps, obstacle to the homogenization goals of these nation states. So how do you put those together, be that religious nationalism, be that strict secularism, as it was under, for example, Kemalist rule or the Baath Party rule in Syria and Iraq, and also secularism in Iran before the revolution, or the post-revolution Iran? How do you explain this inherent, perhaps, contradiction, that inherent, but perhaps only on the surface, that such different political regimes produce similar attitudes towards the Kurdish issue?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. The issue is that we should not think, definitely, we should not think that these ideologies, being Islamist or basically secular or socialist, these ideologies, in terms of the nature of those nation states, are kind of like, as you said, on the surface, these are the secondary nature of these nation states. The Kurdish, basically part of this situation, the Kurdish issue for all of these countries has to do, basically, it's viewed, is perceived as a sort of threat to their territorial integrity, no matter if it is a Islamist country, Islamist nation state like the Iranian post-revolution Iran, no matter if it is basically the Baathist or socialist country or ideology. For all of these things, the issue is that all of these nation states are based on the shared idea of the homogenization and assimilation of the ethnic others. The issue is that for all of those countries, for all of those nation states that you just mentioned, the basic premise is basically the combination of the land, ethnicity, and race. When it comes, for example, to Iran, we have Muslim brothers, and well, they are Muslim, but when it comes to we call them Muslim brother, but when it comes to the Kurdish issue, the Kurdish people are brother as long as they don't they don't demand, basically, their own ethno-linguistic rights, their own ethno-religious rights. So comes to the ethno-religious and linguistic rights that, as you know, have been denied for decades for Kurds, all these countries, come to agreement on the Kurdish issue as just the same as we see the Kurdish issue as an regional, let's say, international colony. With the same token, they see the Kurdish people as an international threat, as an regional threat to their own existence. So the issue is not about the Islam, even if it is about the Islam. For example, look, talking about the post-revolutionary Iran, okay? Well, the post-revolutionary Iran is defined partly, its nationalistic discourse basically is defined partly based on the religion, although the Persian language is still the main component. But anyway, well, it's a religious discourse. But in such a religious discourse, the Kurdish people are defined as Sunni, for example. So here you see that there is no contradiction at all. It's about the difference. When it comes to for example, to the secular nation states such as Turkey, I'm not very familiar with the Turkey. Kamal knows a lot about. He's expert on this issue. Well, when it comes to the Turkey, well, the ethnic element, is highlighted. When it comes to the Iraq, basically to pre-Saddam period, the Kurdish people were Sunni, of course. I mean, they were defined as Sunni, but at the same time, now the ethnic element comes up, in which the Kurdish people, the Kurdish language, the Kurdish culture becomes a problem, perceived as a problem for the majority Arabs in Iraq. So the issue is that for all of those countries, I don't see any contradiction. I don't see any contradiction because I don't think that the secularism or Islamism or socialism, all of these discourse that are basically, as we said, define those nation states, they don't have much to do with the idea of Kurdishness and with the idea of the inclusion, with the idea of the ethnic inclusion. So I don't see any contradiction in that sense.
That was a great answer, and it explains a lot. So on the one hand, so you have multiple layers, kind of like an onion, each layer, or like a Russian doll, that each layer within each another one comes out to the surface, and what is at the core is a common element across all these countries, and that might perhaps explain the contradiction, at least seemingly contradictory nature of these relationships.
It's just a response to one part of your question, because the way you asked about the nation state, I still don't find nation state as an essentially as a problem, because nation state doesn't have one form. It has variety of forms. We have a nation state in Canada, we have a nation state in Switzerland, we have a nation state in Belgium, which at the same time, they have been able to create a kind of multinational state. So what we have in Iran, Turkey, Iraq, Syria is, yes, it's a Jacobin view of nationalism that still believes that any difference could be a threat. But it doesn't mean that, and the way I see it, we really don't have any alternative for the nation state. So there is a possibility to have a nation state with a more human form. There is a possibility of some form of confederate, some form of federalism that should recognize all the difference. But the historical culture or the historically in these countries have been based on elimination and erasure of the difference, which so far has worked this way. And one more thing about the Islamic aspect of it. I think what Etienne Balibar, the French philosopher, talks about is very much true, that in order for the nation state to function, the centers, the borders of the nation have to be internalized by the citizens. And what we have, Islam becomes a secondary thing. Islam becomes the product of this very context that we have. So the reality of the state has been pretty much, very much internalized everywhere. And no one, like no people on the top, the dominant ethno-nations in Iran and Iraq and Turkey, questions the borders they have. Actually, the religious one are more militant about protecting that, and they are willing to pray in 90,000 mosques, just go across the borders and kill the Kurds, assuming that the fact that the state declares them as the enemy, they are essentially religious enemy as well. So what you have is that religion has become an addendum, become a kind of supplementary thing to the nationalism, and has gained an extraordinary sense of identity. So that's why thinking of religion in isolation or in isolation from the idea of nationalism and nation state becomes extremely problematic.
This is very interesting. Yes. Now, if we change track perhaps in our remaining time, because I really want to focus also on your very important, exciting work, and I think is the only work that spends such a great time and in detail explaining the dynamics of it, is the concept of Kolberi. And I find it very fascinating for one, and also the lack of research on it is also very interesting. So if I may perhaps direct the conversation towards the Kolberi issue or Kolberi problem, or phenomena. So what is Kolberi? If you can explain to us in brief words what it is it unique to Kurdistan, and why do you think it is neither legal nor entirely illegal, quote unquote?
Well, the Kolberi, first, I mean, literally, Kolberi, as you know, well, Kolberi comes from two words, kol and beri. Kol means basically back, or let's say shoulder sometimes, and beri means or carrying something. So Kolberi means carrying goods and things on one's back. So Kolberi as a job, as a labor, as a work, has existed, in Kurdistan for a long time. It has been there, but it was not a job model. It wasn't prevalent. It wasn't dominant. It wasn't practiced by such a basically quantity of people. There were some people basically, at the border. They were importing, exporting goods and commodities in Iran-Iraq border. But it wasn't a prevalent job. It wasn't an occupation. It wasn't a sort of model. Let's say a sort of work model. Until
so this is a full-time job for a large number of people who are carrying goods across the border regions, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, but about your first part of question, second part of question, is Kolberi specific to Kurdistan? Well, yes and no. Yes, no, because we have basically shuttle labor in many parts of the world. Even right now, there is, in Eastern Europe, we have in Vietnam, we have in Africa, in Mexico. We have seen some sort of border trade, border informal economy at the border. But Kolberi has some specifics that it's exclusive to Kurdistan at large, because as you say, as you know, there are also Kolberis working at the Turkey border. So what is specific about the Kolberi in Kurdistan? The first thing is that Kolberi in Kurdistan is not a result of the let's say economic stagnation. It's not a cause of for example, of the economic policy. In fact, it's an outcome of a very deliberate and very intentional policy that has been implemented by the Iranian state, Iranian Islamic State, over last 4 decades, and even further. We have to put Kolberi into a wider historical context in which the Kurdish people have been denied of the economic investment, not just the language. The language was part of it, but economic investment, and development. Just for information, for example, just to show you the historical context of this economic situation in Kurdistan. For example, the only factory in Kurdistan was established in 1968 in entire border cities of the Kurdish border cities of the Western Azerbaijan province, just to show you the location, because I don't accept such a sort of political bordering. But the only factory was established in 1968. So if you put Kolberi in that situation, you see that there is a deliberate policy operating behind the development and deprivation of Kurdistan. And another thing about Kolberi is that, as we said, Kolberi is neither legal or illegal. That means that there is not any law in the Iran's basically, labor law or in Iran's constitution telling that the Kolberi border trade is legal or illegal. And let's just talk about, bring some evidence from the authorities. For example, the supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Islamic Republic, says that the Kolbers should not be killed because they are not smugglers. They are just carrying some goods to survive. From the other side, you see that the local authorities would say that we do not have such a thing as Kolberi, and Kolberi are smugglers, and they should be treated as smugglers. So even, look, even if the Kolbers are smugglers, they should be benefited from some sort of law protection. While you see that the Kolbers get shot and injured on daily basis without any consequences, without any basically media coverage. So this is another specific of the Kolberi in Kurdistan. And the third specific of Kolberi in Kurdistan is that the Kolberi now has become a dominant, a prevalent occupation. Just imagine, according to the official reports, there are more than 200,000 Kolbers. This is, of course, it's unreliable data because we don't know. We just take it as granted. Okay, well, 200,000 Kolbers. So if one Kolber is supposed to feed one family, it seems that, and if we take each family as a size of like 5 people, that means that 1 million of Kurdish people, 1 million of Kurdish people live on Kolberi. And if you put it in a larger picture, assuming that the Kurdish total population in Iran you just estimated as a sort of 10 million, it means that 10%, 20% of the entire Kurdish population in Iran basically is relied on Kolberi. This is specifically in Kurdistan. You can't find any country, any community in the world in which 20%, 10% of people live on Kolberi and still they get killed, they get injured on daily basis. Just imagine, there are some days in Iran, in Eastern Kurdistan, there are some days that we have 25 Kolberi that they got shot or injured in one single day. So we can barely find a day in Eastern Kurdistan over the last 5 years, specifically from 2015, that we don't have the incidents of killing or injuring the Kolberi. So that's why that the Kolberi is very unique to Eastern Kurdistan, and also the amount of the violence that is in this sort of job. When any Kolberi, they get killed on everyday life and they get killed at will. Some of those Kolbers, they hold ID card. Basically, they call it P-Level card, which is a sort of border trade card. So they're officially holding such a sort of identification card, but still they get shot. Okay. Some of the Kolbers in the middle of night, they get stopped, and they stop when they were basically halted, and they get shot. So in last 5 years, the incidence of killing and injuring Kolbers has been a sort of a regular news on social media in Eastern Kurdistan, and the authorities knows about it. So what's the question here? What is the Iranian regime is going to do with the Kolbers? Well, the Iranian regime is not going to uproot the Kolberi. It's not going to improve the situation. They want to keep Kolberi. Why? Because the Kolbers, at the same time, they help the Iranian regime in many ways. They act like a corridor. They act like a sort of way for Iranian regime to bypass the sanction, because all of those commodities and all of those goods that are carried out by the Kolbers are legally exchanged and consumed in Iran. So it's not such a thing that they don't bring drugs, they don't bring illegal things. So Kolberi has become a sort of opportunity for the Iranian regime to bypass and from the other side, with killing each Kolber in the region, in Eastern Kurdistan, the regime is also sending a message. So the Kolberi is an example of the regime violence, is a sort of site that the regime is practicing the maximum violence against the Kurdish people to remind them of its own, of its power, of its basically, So if you see the Kolberi, as I said, has many functions for the regime. It has the economic functions, it has the cultural functions, it has the basically the social function, and it has the security functions.
Now, this is very interesting, and I think we should have definitely another talk on just the Kolberi alone and perhaps looking at the similarities and differences across other parts of Kurdistan where Kolberis are functioning and existing for a long time, including Turkey, Syria, and Iraq as well.
I a little bit differ from a little bit difference between what is known classically as smuggling, despite the fact smuggling could be a little bit pejorative, with Kolberi. Kolberi, the classic smuggling was done in a different form. It was sometimes would be used for using animals. People who would carry the stuff usually would own those commodities. But I think there is one important historical thing that we should keep in mind. That's why the way I see it, Kolberi is different from classical. Ahmed talked about variety of differences, they were very important. But there is one more thing that in 2009, which I should talk about, in 2009, when Ahmadinejad and the Revolutionary Guards Corps retook the power in Iran, they decided to resecuritize Kurdistan in a much stronger measure so actually it's then that economy becomes extreme, one of the main tools of politics for the regime and for the security forces of the regime, especially which regime since then has become mostly as a security regime, as a military regime, which it was a response to the reality that on the other side of the border in Iraqi Kurdistan or Bashur, we had a legal entity that the state thought it would be a danger and it would influence the Kurds on this side. And therefore, they decide to turn Kurdistan. And this is actually, there was a letter attributed to Ahmadinejad that said, we should keep Kurds in this kind of liminal space of hunger and prosperity. So then make Kurdistan as an entity unviable. That way we prevent Kurdistan's viability. And this is how, along many other economic measures, Kolberi came to being. And actually, it's from then that it takes the name Kolberi. Before, even Kurds would call it Qaçaqçı, which is similar to the Turkish word. So, and it's then the Kolberi becomes legal, like many other things that the state would do on the borders, which we don't have to time to talk about it. But probably Kolberi requires a session alone to discuss
I agree. Yes. I think that there's a lot more that can be and should be said and talked about this legal/illegal identity or space that is given to Kolberis and people in the borderlands. That also has to go back to the division of Kurdistan, I think, to multiple parts where the borders do not mean much.
Yes.
And it has also moral implications about people who are actually visiting different parts of their lands or villages in many cases, or family members. I'll have to end, I think, this segment today. We are already over time, but this was really exciting and thought-provoking, and we should revisit some of these questions, including the resistance and the hope part, like how Kurds develop what form of resistance to oppression and the development. I think that we'll wait for next time. I would like to thank you both for this very thought-provoking interview and conversation, and hope to see you again.
Thank you and your program for organizing this. I'm very much grateful to be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting us. Thank you very much. We would love to continue our discussion, as we said, and specifically on Kolberi.